Today on our 2016 Ram 4500, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the SumoSprings Solo Custom Helper Springs for the rear axle. That's going to be part number SSR-309-54. If you ever hauled a heavy load or had a big trailer behind your Ram, you probably experienced what a lot of us do, where the back end starts to squat down and we may get a little bit of sway and some body roll back there. And when that squatting happens, we're putting a lot of unwanted strain and stress on the rear suspension. It's going to wear things out over time, and really our tires aren't where they should be and our suspension isn't where it should be either. And since the back end is getting pushed down, the front end is getting lifted up slightly, which means our tires aren't going to make full contact. We're going to have irregular tire wear, as well as our headlights being out of alignment. But upgrading the rear suspension is definitely going to help with that. It's going to support the load back here and keep our suspension where it should be, nice and level. And it's going to prevent as much squatting. And it's also going to help with body roll because it's going to be able to counteract that and not sway as much. And since it's not pushing down so hard and we have that extra support in the back, it's not lifting up so much in the front. So we'll have better tire wear, better steering response, and our headlights will be realigned. So now that we've gone over some of the benefits and seen what they look like, let's show you how to get them installed. So here's what our helper springs are going to look like once we have them installed. Now these are going to replace our factory joust stops, and they're going to install in between the frame and our axle. And here's our factory joust stop compared to our new spring, and you can see that there's quite a bit of difference there. Our helper springs are going to provide us that extra support when we're loaded down, whereas our factory joust stop is really just there to prevent the frame from hitting the axle. These are going to improve the stability and comfort of our truck whenever we're hauling a heavy load or towing a heavy trailer. It's going to do that because whenever the suspension is loaded down and it begins to come down, this is going to make contact with the axle and help support that extra load in there. It's also going to absorb a lot of the bumps and shocks we feel when we're driving down the road and minimize sway so we can have a lot more comfortable ride. Now our springs are going to have a progressive rate, which means that if we have a light load, they're going to engage softly. But if we have a heavier load, the stiffer they're going to get. They're going to compress mainly vertically and have very little outer expansion, so we don't have to worry about any other components that are going to be close to it. Each one of our springs is going to work independently from each other, so it's going to help with those off-center loads, uneven terrain, or even whenever we're turning really hard or taking evasive maneuvers. Our helper springs are going to be completely maintenance-free. We're not going to have to worry about airlines or tubing and worrying about monitoring the pressure inside. It's going to be a simple one-time installation and we don't have to mess with them anymore. Our springs are going to be made out of a high-density microcellular urethane, and it's going to resist damage caused by oils, road salts, and UV rays, and it's going to work in temperatures from -25 all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Our springs are going to have a 2,800 pound load capacity, but keep in mind these are not meant to increase the payload of your truck. They're just there for extra support when we have those heavy loads in the back. To begin our installation, we're going to come to the rear axle, and right above that we'll have our factory joust stop. I already went ahead and sprayed a little bit of spray lubricant on there, but it's always a good idea to soak it down because these bolts can rust because there's really not anything protecting them, especially if you have a salt truck like we have here. Then you're going to want to grab a 16mm socket, and there's going to be a bolt on the back side as well as on the front of our bump stop holding it in place. So we'll pull those out. And you want to hold on to the hardware because we are going to reuse it. Now in each side we're going to have our spring, 2 spacers, a smaller spacer, and a plate. Now we're going to have several pieces of hardware, and which one we use is going to be determined by how many spacers we're going to use. If we use both of them, we'll use the long one. If we use just one of the large spacers, we'll use the middle one. And if we don't use either of these, we'll use the short one. But we'll start out by taking our plate. You'll notice the center section is going to have this recessed area in it. We want to take our factory bolts so the threads are coming up through that area where the recessed is. And we'll take one of our large spacers, we'll line it up with the hole that's on top of our spring, and then we'll take the small spacer. This is going to be so that the bolts can clear everything. We'll set that on top. Then we'll take our plate with the bolts facing up and set it directly down. Now again, since we're using one of our large spacers, we're going to be using the middle length bolt. So we'll loosely thread the bolt in. Then we can grab a 7/32 Allen socket and tighten it up. Now the reason why we put one spacer in is because our bolts are going to go back into the factory spot. So it's going to be sitting like this once it's installed. And a good rule of thumb is you want about anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of space between the bottom of the spring and the top of the axle when the truck is fully unloaded. So if you need to bring the spring down closer to the axle, we could add another spacer in, or if it's too close to the axle, we could take the spacer out. We're going to take our spring, we'll line up our bolts with the factory holes. We just want to get them loosely started by hand. There is going to be a very limited space in here, but we should be able to get our finger in there just enough to get a couple threads on there, and then it'll support itself, and then we can get the other one started as well. Now because of the limited space, we're not going to be able to get a socket back on that bolt, but we can get an open-ended 16mm wrench and we'll tighten it up. Now you want to tighten up a little bit, draw the plate up, and then move to the other side so it doesn't get in a bind. Once we have both bolts tight on our spring, we're going to go and repeat the same process on the other side. That'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings Solo Custom Helper Springs for the rear axle, part number SSR-309-54 on our 2016 Ram 4500.